Welcome to the Holy Post. Immediately after President Biden announced his college loan forgiveness plan, Christians started debating it. Some are saying that debt forgiveness is deeply biblical. Others say it's completely immoral. Who's right? And could both sides actually be missing the point? Then Phil is still processing the last French Friday episode about why so many politically active evangelicals see policy goals as absolute, but Christian virtues as flexible. He offers his theories. Then I talked to Pastor Rich Villodas about his new book, Good and Beautiful and Kind, and how he's managed to avoid the many pitfalls that other pastors fall into. All of that, plus row, row, row your pumpkin? Here is episode 524.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I'm here with Skye. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
And Caitlin Shess is back. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
It's been 3 weeks since we talked to Caitlin. We had 2 weeks of Christian in a row. Now we're back to Caitlin, and everyone is asking the question. All of America wants to know, did you finish the first draft of your book?
You know what's funny? In a class I was in, we were talking about how the questions you ask can just be a question to get information, or it can be a question that shames someone. And I feel like
those are the only two options.
No, those are just
it.
two options of many options. And I feel like that was a shaming question. No, I am not done. I extended my deadline by a couple of weeks.
Oh, okay.
And it's going to get done.
If you can yourself extend a deadline, is it really a deadline?
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, I did ask my editor, could I have 2 weeks or could I have a month? And she was like, please only take 2 weeks.
Okay.
So...
But now you're back in school. So how's that work?
It's going to be a rough time. It's okay. There's a lot of overlap. Like, theology classes get you excited about theology and then you go write some. But the downside is I am working right now on some Cold War eschatology stuff, which means I'm reading really weird books in public in class. And I feel like I need a big sticker that says... for research purposes only, because I don't want people thinking I'm sitting reading Left Behind, for fun, or because I believe it.
Okay, and now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. We discuss some very serious topics sometimes. We get into the weeds on very hard stuff. This is not one of those. A 60-year-old man in Nebraska paddles 38 miles in a huge pumpkin to set a record.
Is this a Roald Dahl
That's what I was going to say.
story?
It is James and the Giant Peach come to life. Dwayne Hansen walked into the mayor's office in Bellevue, Nebraska, asking for volunteers to witness a record-setting feat. 2 city employees went along with the unusual request to watch a giant pumpkin float down the Missouri River. But Hansen wasn't just going to send his pumpkin down the river by itself. Instead, the gourd enthusiast had hollowed it out so he could ride inside and paddle. So, his pumpkin, you want to know how big the pumpkin was?
Yes.
How big?
Because can you imagine, taking one of your jack-o'-lanterns after Halloween and trying to float down the Missouri River in it? No,
This is like Charlie Brown and the Giant Pumpkin.
Mm-hmm.
It is. 846-pound pumpkin. So almost a 1,000-pound pumpkin. A half-ton pumpkin. Okay.
So what's the diameter of that? Does it say?
Well, you can Google it and see pictures. It's probably 5 feet across or so. It is large, but it's not so large where it looks like it would be stable.
No.
You see, you found it?
Yeah, no.
And also, an 846-pound pumpkin does not ride high in the water. Can I just say that?
Oh, wow.
It rides,
He's standing in it, though. That's kind of impressive.
He's squatting.
Well, he's standing.
I don't know what he's doing.
Oh.
In the picture you got, he's standing.
He's standing with his arms up. That's some balance.
With a paddle, a life jacket, and a camo baseball cap, Hansen climbed aboard the homegrown boat and set off from the docks in Bellevue at 7:30 a.m. on August 25th, his birthday, his 60th birthday. This is his birthday present to himself. His destination was Nebraska City, 38 miles and an estimated 6 hours away. It was his 60th birthday, and he intended to spend the occasion breaking the record for longest distance floated in a pumpkin. Did you know that that's something that the Guinness Book of World Records keeps track of?
No. I have
No, I
some
did not.
questions.
Do they create new categories for these?
Surely.
They do, but he was
Surely.
trying to break the record. He was trying to break the record, so there was already a record, and it was 25 miles was the record.
Wow.
I have some questions.
Yes, Caitlin.
So
Caitlin.
first of all, I want to know if he grew the pumpkin himself.
Yes,
but
he did.
Second of
Yes,
all,
it was his pumpkin.
did anyone besides the city employees watch him?
Oh, yes, there was quite a crowd.
Okay.
Yes,
It
and
was
he was
sounded like he
cheered
didn't
on
have any
on-
friends.
No. He needed officials. He wanted
He needed someone to
trying-
notarize it.
Okay.
Yes, he was trying to figure out how you could make it official so that the
Yes.
Guinness
Okay.
people would have to pay attention to you.
Good.
At 2:50, so he started at 7 a.m., 7:30 a.m. At 2:52 p.m., he had traveled 25.5 miles, which broke the pumpkin floating record.
Did
for
he stop?
distance. No.
Good,
He did
good.
not stop. He kept going and finally arrived in Nebraska City at 6:30 p.m. 11 hours after, so it took much longer than he estimated. It took 11 hours for him to paddle 38 miles down the Missouri River in a giant pumpkin. So, picture this. It's your birthday. What do you want to do? Would you like to spend 11 hours squatting in a gourd
No.
for your birthday?
No.
No?
No.
No.
And
That
at
doesn't
60, that's impressive. That's a lot of physical activity.
Yeah, what did he
for a
do?
60-year-old.
For
Yeah.
I want to know what he was thinking about, or
He was paddling.
for
He was
11
paddling,
hours.
Thinking, happy birthday to me. I'm going to
my
be in the
gosh.
Guinness Book of World Records if the mayor's men keep following me down the shore, chronicling my journey and verifying that I never came ashore or never was towed by a jet ski.
Is there
Probably what they were worried about.
Is there an actual history of people using pumpkins or gourds in general for boats?
Yeah, are you making
that seems
fun
like-
of someone's culture, Phil?
Is this a
I'm
cultural
gonna
appropriation?
Say no. I'm going to say no. I'm going to say there is not, partly because it takes a lot of work to grow pumpkins that large. They really have to be hand grown. And I don't know if anyone
How do
has
you
ever-
That doesn't
hand grow
seem-
something that weighs 800 pounds?
You like feed it milk. If you want to make a huge
Are you
pumpkin,
making stuff up now?
Yeah, no. There's a way that you take a vine and you can tap the vine into a
To
bowl
a cow?
No, into a bowl of milk. You
I see this like umbilical cord going from a cow to a pumpkin.
No.
That's not how you grow. I read once how you grow a giant pumpkin, and it's very specific, and it's kind of a lot of work. So the notion that Native Americans would have grown giant pumpkins as boats is not very likely. It's way easier to make boats out of logs or, skins or whatever. He kept going, though. But just imagine 11 hours in that position. I spent 3 hours in a canoe once with two of my kids going down the Green River in Kentucky. And I was like, wow, we've been in this canoe for a long time.
Yeah, but he was alone, which meant it was probably more tolerable.
Maybe, I guess.
Or
But
lonely.
Did he have to go to the bathroom ever?
He's in a
11
pumpkin.
hours? What's your point?
He could just hang his butt over the side and
No,
he's
it would
fine.
We were
flip.
so
It would
close.
flip.
We were
Have
so
you ever
close.
been in a roundish object in the water?
Yeah.
They're not
Frequently.
stable. They're not stable. No.
Like an inner tube.
No, that's flat.
very
That's like a
different thing.
flat bottom boat. That is
Oh,
not
okay.
like on. Have you ever tried to sit on top of a beach ball?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
but I
you
haven't
can't.
been like in the beach ball
Yeah, it's
because then the center of gravity is low and stable. I mean,
Right.
he did it for 11 hours. He didn't capsize and sink, so obviously it worked.
It's impressive.
Yeah.
It's impressive. Okay, let's go with Caitlin first. Sermon illustration.
No.
Really? You don't have a sermon illustration.
Oh, see, Skye has one already. Immediately.
I have
Okay,
multiple.
okay, you go first, Guy. You go first.
If Jesus calls you out of the boat and you can't trust him enough, at least have a pumpkin.
What does that mean?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Here's another one.
Anything.
Here's another one.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of Noah's Ark applications here.
Oh,
Oh.
like what?
Like we don't build an ark anymore. It's the fruit of the Spirit that grows the
That's
vessel
not-
that
no,
will
no,
carry
no.
us through the waters of this world.
I grew my salvation.
I
in
think
my backyard.
I think the sermon illustration is when you learn there's a ridiculously stupid thing someone has done, don't try and one-up them.
Why not? He did it.
Right. The answer is we all go, this looked like a stupid thing to do. Let's not. Let's not do that in our, because it well, I don't know.
How about this? How about this? Everyone has a
biblical
mission.
idea.
Everyone has a mission that they dedicate themselves to, and they're not all equal.
Some are better.
Yeah, and some are dumb.
Because
Like
some
the pumpkin.
inspire.
Okay.
Do you know there's a tug-of-war that happens once a year between two towns that are on opposite sides of the Mississippi River? They pull a rope all the way across the Mississippi River, and then they have a tug-of-war, an annual tug-of-war between a town in Illinois and a town in Iowa. I just learned about this. It's fascinating.
And what does the winner get?
I forget. They have a trophy that goes back and forth or something, and it's a big event. It's like a festival on both sides.
I do think both of those are
river.
good, like, meaningless goals we have in life versus like eternal good things.
What do you mean they're good, meaningless goals? Is that sarcastic?
No, one is a meaningless
okay.
thing. One is an eternal good thing.
Which
How
one
about
of
an
those?
eternal
Is the pumpkin
gourd?
the eternal good, or
No,
is the tug-of-war the eternal
neither.
good?
Those are both examples of meaningless striving.
But is that bad? Is that bad? So we shouldn't do those
Yeah.
things.
Is
Is
there-
that what you're telling to
Is
the
there
good
anything
people?
redemptive about what this guy did? I think there
He
is.
set a record. He showed human innovation and adapting God's creation because of climate change there won't be any more
Oh, my
boats,
goodness.
and he'll be standing there to say, we still have boats. We just hook your cow up to a pumpkin vine and you can make your own boat.
Here's the thing. I think part of coming out of a Northern European Protestant tradition, loosely,
Yeah.
we tend to heavily emphasize the pragmatic and
Yes.
the useful, right?
Yes.
And I'm just saying, Caitlin, of all people, you were just in Italy looking at art for.
Yes.
Don't you dare compare that
I am.
to the
I'm going
pumpkin.
there. Sometimes there is value in that which doesn't have great utility.
Agreed.
Right?
Agreed.
It's
This
just
is
for
not
the beauty, for the amusement,
Or
for the
great-
humor.
Great buoyancy. Would you rather float down the Missouri in a pumpkin or on the Mona Lisa? See, I'll take a pumpkin every day.
What is even happening?
Great
I
art
wonder,
is not
there
buoyant.
was obviously a lot of pulp and seed that came out of such a huge pumpkin. Did they use
yeah.
that for something?
That's
Did
a
they make
good question.
pies?
Maybe they chummed the water to attract pumpkin sharks.
Oh, you get those Asian flying carp.
Oh, yeah. They don't have them in the Missouri River, though. They're in the Illinois River.
Why wouldn't they be in the Missouri?
Because they were raising them on the shores of the Illinois River, and there was a flood that overflowed the banks of the
I thought
the
they
farm.
came. I thought they came up like the Mississippi.
No, they're not in the Mississippi. They're trying to keep them out of the Mississippi and out of the Great Lakes. Most importantly, the flying Asian carp invasion. Caitlin, do you not know about this either?
They jump out of the water and slap you in the face.
They whack you in the head.
I'm
They're
more
like
just
Ninevite fish.
How did this happen? What series of events in my life led me to be involved in this conversation?
Be here.
All the good ones.
You forgot to put on the front of your book for research only.
Yeah,
that's
why
what
I
did.
did. That's what I did.
We mistook you for a non-serious person because you were reading The Late Great Planet Earth. Okay, I want to follow up on something from last week. Okay, and also from French Friday from last week. Caitlin, did you have time to listen to either of those last Wednesday or French Friday? Oh, she did.
It's because she's not writing her book.
You're supposed to be writing your book.
Okay.
Oh, Skye, that's just
Sometimes
me.
I don't do things for utilitarian purposes. I do them to enjoy things.
Well, all right.
So-
you can
so-
send your apology to Mr. Pumpkin Floater down there.
Mr. Pumpkin Floater. David French said something on French Friday, that I thought was very interesting. He was asking the question, why are Christian political ethics, in his view, upside down? Where we say the virtue is negotiable, the policy is non-negotiable. And we try to find the policy rooted in the Bible. And he remembered back to people trying to teach, in the 80s and 90s, trying to teach Christians how to vote, like trying to activate the Christian community as a voting bloc. And unlike the movement for better Christian parenting or better Christian marriages, which focused more on principles and virtues, the movement for a better Christian America through voting focused on specific policy outcomes. And so the policy outcomes became non-negotiables, and the means to get to them became negotiable. Am I summarizing that right? Is that what you heard?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. So I thought that was really interesting, and it got me to thinking about what was the difference between, the people that initiated those movements, in why were some more concerned with actual Christian virtue, like what does it mean to be a Christian parent, and others seem to be concerned. And my initial theory was that some of the people that started the Activate the Christian Vote movement were honestly not terribly concerned about Christian virtue and were much more concerned about specific policy outcomes.
Or, to be crass, just political power.
Mm-hmm.
To get the policy outcomes you want, though. I mean, I don't know that Paul Weyrich got a lot of personal power, but he got a more conservative America.
Okay.
Yeah? Caitlin, help me out.
I think we also underestimate the extent to which the more proximate you are to power, the more you're susceptible to just desiring more influence. Like, there's a reason why some pastors get invited to the White House and start acting differently around powerful people. Like, there's an allure there and a draw. Maybe not on a kind of structural level, like maybe not a person in a church getting a voting guide isn't thinking, I just want power. But I do think some of the people leading some of those conversations are at least susceptible. Not all of them kind of got drawn into it, but I think we underestimate the extent to which it can seem like we're trying to do it for particular policies, and then at some point we just lose the policy altogether.
Caitlin, do you feel that your behavior has changed given your proximity to Skye and I?
I hope not.
Okay.
The power just radiates from us.
So you can handle proximity to power.
I mean,
is that what you're saying?
I don't want to offend you, but
is that what you're saying? Oh, offend Skye. Offend Skye. Address your remarks to Skye. Okay. So here's my question. Was the religious right, and you make Skye, you're probably going to say, duh, of course. Was the religious right really always about an ideological vision for America, as opposed to saying we need to encourage people to walk in the way of Jesus?
Duh, yeah.
I knew it. I knew you'd say that.
Well, and here's why. And not to disparage people back in the 80s and 90s who were part of the religious right, because they understood
I was.
Well, right, but
of.
I think to be completely fair, they understood that the local church, its function was to teach people virtue and to live morally and to follow the way of Jesus. The purpose of these religiously organized political action committees, or the religious right, was to then mobilize those people in Washington, D.C. or state capitals to initiate policy changes. So they weren't saying virtue didn't matter. They just said that's the purview of the local church. We're interested in policy outcomes. And they weren't saying we're going to do it by any means necessary. There was an assumption that we would do it in a virtuous way because these people are coming from the local church. I think what they didn't anticipate, at least the average person, is how much the local church over the last 30 years has been eclipsed by the media and political action. And so whatever virtue the local church is trying to push has been just completely outweighed by the policy goals of organized Christian political movements. That's what changed.
Okay. Caitlin, help me out.
I mean, I think that's what Skye said is right. I think we've underestimated the extent to which, especially in the last few years, people really truly have kind of bought into a particular political theology that says there are a different set of rules for me personally and for me politically. I remember Jerry Falwell Jr., when I was a student at Liberty, loved quoting when Jesus said, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's." And what he meant was there's just a different set of rules politically. The things I value are different. And I remember telling people, he sounds kind of like a really perverted two kingdoms idea, that there's really, like, not how Luther actually intended it, but this idea throughout history that has often caused people to withdraw from really important political questions because they're like, that's the other kingdom. The rules are different. Who has power is different. And I have control over this kingdom. And people said, oh, he's not thinking like that seriously about it. And then it was like a few months later, he did an interview. It was like the Washington Post or the New York Times or something. And he said, let me explain to you what I mean when I quote this. I mean, there's two kingdoms. In the one kingdom, you fight for America first. And in the other kingdom, you turn the other cheek. And I was like, so that's really, like, I think we've underestimated the extent to which, yes, we are confused about particular policies and virtues. And, like, you know, we've elevated, as David French described, we've elevated certain policies above the virtues required of the people enacting them. But I also think we've ignored the fact that outside of those, like, particular pressing questions of, like, what we do with immigration or what we do with, like, you know, economic systems or what, there's a foundational, like, political theology going on that says there's a different set of rules for these two realms. And so I'm free to just kind of crunch the numbers and go with whatever policy works in one realm. In the other realm, I'm, you know, required by scripture to do things that might be countercultural, that might sacrifice things for myself, but I'm not required to do those things in the public sphere.
Yeah. And to be fair, it's not just that there's a kingdom in the personal, private, moral realm and a different one in politics. You see the same thing in other areas. I remember years ago meeting this business leader who ran a company, had, I think, a factory, Christian guy, and his mindset was, my only real goal in business is to be profitable and make a ton of money. That's it. And he kept his faith completely separate from that. And then when somebody pointed out, no, actually, God does care about the way you run your business, and he started reading the Bible through that lens, it completely changed his life. And he realized, oh, I need to give my people a living wage, and I need to not destroy the environment with my company, and I need to care about the poor in my community. And it transformed the way he did business. But growing up as a Christian,
bankrupt.
No, I think he's done quite well. But the mindset was, faith is in this area, business is in this area. We do that all the time in popular evangelicalism in different ways. So it's not a surprise we would do that in politics.
It reminded me of the Tony Perkins interview, you know, the famous quote he gave. And Tony Perkins runs the Family Research Council, FRC, Family Research Council, which was started by James Dobson. At one point was part of Focus on the Family. James Dobson is one of the 4 or 5 key founders of the religious right. But he gave an interview and said that evangelical Christians, quote, "we're tired of being kicked around by Barack Obama and his leftists. And I think they are finally glad," this is referring to Trump, "there is someone on the playground that is willing to punch the bully." So Barack Obama was the bully, and Donald Trump is going to punch him. And that's the famous point where the interviewer said, well, what happened to turning the other cheek? And Tony Perkins, one of the leaders of the religious right, said, you know, you only have 2 cheeks. Christianity is not all about being a welcome mat, which people can just stomp their feet on. We need to stomp our feet on other people every now and then.
In other words, we shouldn't always have to be the one on the cross. When do we get to crucify some people?
Yeah. Oh, don't put it on that footing. Oh, Skye.
That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
Skye.
It does really sound like James and John talking to Jesus, right? Like, we want to be at your right and left, and Jesus going, like, this is the path in front of me is crucifixion, not this power that you think you're going to get. It's like a perennial problem.
But the crucifixion is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for giving up control of your life so that God can tell you what to do, and then you can go get power for God.
I don't think he needs any more.
He is getting his butt kicked by Barack Obama and his leftists.
That is one thing that drives me up the wall, is how many people, at least rhetorically, they give an excuse for their behavior in the public square because they're defending Jesus.
Yes.
How pathetic does your Jesus have to be if you think he needs you to defend him?
Well, he's just one guy. and the leftists are legion. We are legion.
I think when people use that argument, they are confessing how truly anemic their faith is, and how I wouldn't worship their God because that God is so weak and pathetic. Why would I surrender my life to them?
And
so it makes no sense to me.
It's so ironic because I've spent some time recently reading all of these, I think I said this a few weeks ago, social gospel preachers, like late 19th, early 20th century. And it's the conservatives telling them, your Jesus is so weak because you feel like he couldn't establish the kingdom he wanted unless you helped him. And it's the conservatives being like, Jesus doesn't need you to do the things that Jesus is going to do. It's just ironic that, when you're the one that feels like you're threatened, all of a sudden your Jesus is very weak.
Wow. Well, yeah, because I feel threatened. If he was, stronger, why would I feel threatened? Oh, okay. My last theory in thinking about this was perhaps the founders of the religious right didn't push virtue over policy because they were afraid if they just told Christians to vote and vote in accordance with Jesus' call to love your neighbor, they might actually vote for some kind of lefty ideas. Maybe.
I mean, I feel like that's what people my age tend to say is like, it's a different time frame, but still say to their elders in the faith, like, you told me to read the Bible. You told me to take it seriously. It has demanded these things of me. And now you've acted like I'm a heretic because I think that we should have policies that support the poor and we should, have loan forgiveness and I'm trying to be faithful to the scripture that you gave us. We're not perfectly and not always in, ways that we might think are the right ways, but there are precedents for that.
There might be a third hypothesis.
Oh, okay.
Which is if you really do emphasize the unchanging Christian virtues that we find in the New Testament, the problem with that is you're going to find people on the left who also exhibit those qualities, right? And that's not good for politics. So I think what ended up happening is it wasn't just that they emphasized policy goals and diminished virtue. I think what they did is they made the policy goals virtuous themselves. Oh. So in other words, you can say if you're pro-life, that is inherent, and in what it means politically to be pro-life, that is inherently virtuous. And if you are pro-choice, that is inherently evil, regardless of how you pursue that idea. Or take a different one that's less perhaps polarizing. If you believe in lowering taxes, that's inherently virtuous. But if you believe in raising taxes on the wealthy, no matter how humble and compassionate and merciful that policy may be motivated by, it's inherently evil. Right. So when you make the virtue itself, the policy itself, the virtue, then you can capture people and say, it doesn't matter what you do anymore, just pursue these things and you are godly as a result. I think that's more what happened.
And what if we say pulling the Supreme Court to the right is virtuous, and pulling it to the left or even leaving it split evenly to reflect the split of the country is evil?
Yeah.
That's, okay. Wow. I feel like we're learning so much.
I think we're writing Caitlin's book for her.
No.
Caitlin's book. Caitlin, you still have enough room in your book to work in as some sort of illustration, a man in a giant pumpkin. Somewhere.
I have the room. I do not have the will.
Caitlin.
So,
that was like a dagger in my heart.
Seriously, I have to confess something. Back when I was on staff at our church, you know Tim Johnson very well.
I do.
He was a good
I
friend.
was like, no.
Good friend and an elder at the church for a while. And sometimes on a Sunday morning, he would pull me aside and say something like, I'll buy you lunch if somehow you can work Lord of the Rings into the sermon this morning. Or if you can say the words Obi-Wan Kenobi in your sermon, like in a coherent way, I'll get you coffee or whatever. It's like he would do that to me from time to time. And I always took the bait. I always did it. And just for my own kicks and giggles, but it was like, you need to do that, Caitlin. You need to work a pumpkin into this book somewhere.
Yeah, pumpkin book.
Just pumpkin.
Okay.
Pumpkin
I will
book.
tell you, I have learned a lot of very weird, there's enough weird stuff in American political history that I'm sure if I tried to find a pumpkin with a Bible verse on it or something,
that's why I give you weird stories so that you can make these connections between weird American history and weird. We're still weird.
It doesn't even have to be like a great story. It could just be like you're referencing some political figure, and you can say that he had a large face and was often bloodshot. He looked like a giant pumpkin, right? Something like that.
Floating
Just
down
work
the
the
Missouri.
word pumpkin into this book, and I will feel
And
like
floating down the Missouri. Okay,
There you
I
go.
need to go on to the next story before we run out of time. Republicans opposing student loan relief are forgetting the biblical tradition of debt forgiveness. This is from William Barber and Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who's been on the show a few years ago. So President Biden did something that kind of got a lot of people activated, triggered, some positively, some negatively.
Joe Biden squints funny during a talk, and people are, divided
Triggered,
over it. One side says he's
activated.
thinking, the other side, he's having a brain aneurysm.
Yeah. So President Biden announced the forgiveness of a certain amount of student loan debt. Has been rumored for a long time, been talking about, is it possible to do it for a long time? It's finally happened. Republicans have responded by declaring their opposition to the very idea of debt forgiveness. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell accused Biden of socialism. Well, what a shock there.
Yeah.
While Pennsylvania Representative Dan Moisier declared it a moral hazard to forgive self-imposed debt. Barber and Hartgrove go on to say, but nothing exposes the hypocrisy of Christian nationalism more than Republicans' knee-jerk reaction against debt forgiveness. It is, after all, something Jesus taught his disciples to pray for. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. But what if we pray trespasses and trespassers? Then we're
No
not.
more debts forgiven.
We're not commanded to forgive debts. So that's their angle. Debt forgiveness is biblical. It's Christian. We should be in favor of it. And if you're not in favor of it, you're a hypocrite, and you're just showing that you're not thinking well. Okay, now before we go on, because we're going to vote on who's right here, our friend David French jumps in and says, is there a Christian case for Biden's debt relief plan? He says, yes, there is a Christian case for the debt relief plan, but there's also an argument against it that is grounded in the biblical conception of justice. So David French says it's radically generous what Biden is proposing, but the generosity is backwards. It's taking from those who have less and giving to those who have more. And this is the argument that many are making, that if you're a college graduate, you already have a leg up on everyone else, and to take tax money from high school graduates and give it to college graduates. High school graduates will earn less throughout their lives. College graduates will earn more. So it's backwards. It's upside down. The Biden debt relief plan will take money from high school graduates and transfer that money straight up to college graduates. Jason Furman wrote in The Atlantic, and this is quoted by David French, once you frame it as 320 million people paying for a benefit for 30 million people, it makes you think a lot harder. You're giving a benefit to someone making $200,000 a year. How important is it to give them relief? And then David French also questions whether it will actually stand up as being legal for the president to do that, which is, I would say, another issue entirely.
Yes.
Whether it's legal or not. We're going to back up to say, okay, who do we agree with more here? Barber and Hartgrove, or our friend David French? Who do we agree with more? What do we think that each one gets right? What do we think each one gets wrong?
That's a better question.
Yeah.
I don't want to
It's not
vote.
shame-inducing.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, fine. You guys are kind of soft. This is a hard-hitting news program.
Oh my goodness.
We're here
Yeah.
to mix it up.
I think it's important to note that I saw someone tweet, I don't remember who it was. It was not someone I was prone to particularly trust, but someone tweeted something about, why wasn't it okay for us to cite Psalm 139 in support of overturning Roe v. Wade, but now it's okay for us to cite the Jubilee in support of the point being, people are selective when they want to cite scripture for political purposes, which is undoubtedly true. I think two of the things that have gotten missed in this conversation, one, I do think it's very unhelpful to just sort of cite the Jubilee or cite the parable or cite, a single verse and then just kind of say, and obviously this entire policy that is in a different cultural context with a vastly different governmental and economic system than would have even been conceivable at the time. I agree that just sort of citing a verse isn't helpful. I worry, though, that the people who are a little quick, I think we should be both suspicious of proof texting for policies, but we should also be suspicious of our own selves kind of not wanting to have Scripture really demand something sacrificial of us, or even just demand something of us when it comes to policies. Like, at the very least, there is a description in Scripture, especially in the Jubilee, a description that recognizes that in human communities, it is just because of the fallenness of the world and the fallenness of human hearts going to be an inclination to have wealth accumulate generationally in particular communities and not others, and that there needs to be a mechanism for trying to prevent that from happening or to rectify that when it does happen. How that works out with student loan forgiveness is an open question, but at the very least, I feel like there's too many people either saying, I quoted the verse, that's the end of the conversation, or no, that really doesn't fit, so it doesn't mean anything. As if, huge swaths of the Old Testament in particular just have nothing to say to our political lives, even though they have quite a bit to say. The second thing that I think has really been lost, I think so much of the conversation has been on the part of Biden's plan that is just forgive a huge sum of student loans for people, which, full disclosure, would really benefit me, and I'm pretty thrilled about that. But I also recognize David French's point of my pretty small loan is from seminary, and I could pay it off. And if it was not forgiven, it would not be difficult for me to pay off. So should a taxpayer who did not go to college pay for my loan? Is no, I don't think so. But the part that's really not been talked to enough about is the part of Biden's plan that would say, if you are meeting your reduced monthly payment on your loan, you will
5% of your dispensable income, I think.
Yes.
Which currently the policy is if you're paying 10%
yes.
Of a certain income amount, they will allow that as your payment. And then if after 10 or 20 years,
I think it's 20, yeah.
You haven't been able to pay it off and it's less than $12,000, the rest will be forgiven. And the new policy is you only have to pay 5% back. And if it's less than $12,000 after 10 years, it's forgiven.
And you won't be accruing interest on it.
And you won't be accruing interest, which is
that's
huge.
the part that is, right. I feel like we've completely missed that because not only is there a scriptural basis for saying that people should not pay interests on, especially on predatory loans, like the 18-year-old that takes out tons of debt because they think they'll get an amazing job. And then they want to, help people, in the legal, they want to be a lawyer that just helps really downtrodden people. And they're not going to make the big bucks they would make as a partner at a big law firm. We want to, recognize that they were young when they made a decision and they want to do something good with their life and they shouldn't be kind of exploited because, I know people who took out what seemed like reasonable loans, paid off the minimum every month, and now owe exponentially more than they owed before. So we have scriptural basis for that, but we also have a really rich, robust Christian tradition that says that usury is wrong, that says that charging interest on a debt because it recognizes the unique situation that someone is in, a vulnerable situation. Anyone who requires a loan is in some kind of lack. Whether or not we think it's justified or not, in some sense, they need something they can't provide for themselves. And so to not only ask them to repay the loan, but to charge interest, especially exorbitant interest rates. There was debates throughout the Middle Ages about what was a okay interest rate or not. But we have this really robust Christian tradition, which I think is part of what distinguishes this from the proof texting, is not just have we really thought through what Scripture's saying, but do we have Christian theological traditions throughout history in different contexts with different governments and different economic systems that help us say this particular practice is exploiting people and we should do something politically to stop it.
Right.
Caitlin, that's a very good point, but I think it fits more with what David French was arguing around the issue of justice rather than just loan. What's a just way of dealing with this problem? There's a misnomer in this whole conversation. We're not talking about loan forgiveness. We're talking about loan reallocation because it isn't like this debt is disappearing. It's just we're asking someone else to pay for it. And is that just? That's the question that David's asking. And I think Hargrove and Barber would say that they're very much focused on justice as a biblical concept. So I think they're kind of talking past one another a little bit. I have problems with this policy, to be honest with you, for those same reasons that I don't think it's not targeted enough and it's not just in the way it's being done. David's article is great; it's worth reading. And but I think that the conservative Republican talking point that forgiveness of debt is inherently immoral and wrong is entirely hypocritical.
Yeah.
Because it's no different than when Trump was president and they pushed through that massive tax cut for the wealthy. They didn't reduce government spending to pay for that tax cut. They were just shifting the cost of government off of the shoulders of the wealthy and putting it more on middle class and poor people. That's no different than taking $10,000 or $20,000 of student loans off of highly educated people and putting it on the shoulders of less educated and less wealthy people. It's the same thing. I think they're both unjust in certain ways, but they both serve a political purpose because the vast majority of college-educated people in this country vote Democrat, and so they get a tax break, essentially, from the government by loan forgiveness. The vast majority of hyper-wealthy people vote Republican, so they got a financial benefit when their guy was in office, and that's the unjust reality of our system.
Okay, here's what I would take to David French, because the people that are opposed to this are painting it as this is a benefit for privileged, upper middle class and upper class children whose parents could, obviously afford, or they could afford it once they get their job at Goldman Sachs. They could afford to pay off. 60% of the people with student loans in America today have Pell Grants.
Yeah.
Pell Grants are for low-income families.
Yep.
So 60% of the people that will benefit from this are from low-income families.
And that's what I mean by more targeted.
Yeah.
It needed to be more targeted on that kind of need.
Yeah, and it is to an extent because the $10,000 forgiveness doubles to $20,000 if you have a Pell Grant.
Yep.
Now, does it need to go all the way up to $125,000 for an individual or $250,000 for a family? I think that's probably more generous than it needs to be.
Yeah.
If you just came out of college and you're already making $125,000, you're really doing well. But here's what motivates me to care about this is, I just watched my son go through 6 years of schooling because he wants to be a family and marriage therapist, marriage and family therapist. And those jobs don't pay very well. Mm-hmm. They honestly, it's a little better than school teachers, but not a whole lot better than school teachers. And think about all the teachers we need that also have to get advanced degrees to do, the two occupations that pay the least but generally require advanced degrees are teachers and pastors. And if we actually required all pastors to have advanced degrees, we'd probably be in a little better shape, but we don't require any training at all. Anyway, my point being, the 6 years of my son's schooling so he can be a therapist saddled him with about $100,000 in debt in student loans. So getting 10 knocked off the top, is great. It's just a little bit of what he's up against. And there's so many kids that want to do social work, that want to be so many, even law students, that want to be public defenders, but they can't afford to because of their student debt. So I feel like David French is discounting the percentage of people that use college to rise out of poverty and the percentage of people that need college to do a job that doesn't pay terribly well.
Okay. Can I defend David for a second?
No.
Against your vicious attack.
He's indefensible. Okay.
So when this policy was announced, a couple days ago, I tweeted something about it, and man, did people get all over me. They were really upset. I mean, they were on me like a 60-year-old on a floating pumpkin. They were just really angry.
Good callback.
Thank you. And so essentially what I was arguing is this does nothing to fix the underlying problem. And I referenced how Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act 10 years ago, the whole debate around the healthcare reform was who should pay for it. Should employers pay for it? Should the government pay for it? Should individuals pay for it? Who's going to pay for our healthcare? But what the ACA never really solved was the fact that it's super expensive. It costs way more to get healthcare in America than virtually any other developed country, and the quality of that healthcare is no better. Same thing with higher education. It's insanely expensive to go to college these days, way more than it was when I was a student. And it's only growing. And this policy of loan forgiveness does nothing to solve that underlying problem. In fact, it may actually make it worse because it incentivizes the colleges to keep charging more and more and more, and it incentivizes students to take out more and more loans under the expectation that, well, eventually it'll get forgiven, or some portion of it will get forgiven. So for a person who wants to be a teacher or a counselor or a pastor, it is prohibitively expensive to go to college these days. And that's not how it is in most countries. It's not how it used to be in the United States. I'm not opposed to this policy in general, but I hope it doesn't like satiate people into thinking, oh, we patched this one up for now.
Right.
And they don't actually pursue a more comprehensive reform of the way we do higher ed in this country, so that more people can have that doorway open. Not just higher ed, but even vocational training and other options besides a 4-year college degree that need to be encouraged and validated in our schools and with. Yeah, it's the whole system is so broken, and it's exploiting American people, just like the healthcare system.
Okay, Skye, now you have to stop talking because
right.
Caitlin needs to say something to you.
I would, as a side note, just recommend people listen to the New York Times podcast, The Argument. They recently re-aired an episode that was great because it was two people who really are trying to think about how this helps the poorest, most vulnerable people in our country. It was not someone who was like, no, this is unfair to forgive people's debts. It was someone who was like, no, debt forgiveness is really good and really important, and here's economic reasons why that cares for the poor. And someone who was saying, I really care about the poor and the vulnerable, and this doesn't solve it. I would recommend that because they know more about the intricacies than probably any of us. Two people who are very involved in it. I would add, though, I think one role that Christians should play, especially Christians who are not economists or not policy experts, is to say that one of the gifts that Scripture gives us is, one, this depiction of human communities. It's important for us, regardless of where we stand on this, to say, God has told us that this is how human communities work, that we exploit vulnerable people, that over time wealth gets concentrated in the hands of a few, and that there needs to be mechanisms. We can debate what kind, but there needs to be mechanisms to address that. Two, I think one of the other gifts that Christians can give to the conversation is to say, this isn't just about justice. Justice is an important part of it, but it's also about what kind of community do we want to have? What kind of society do we want to have? Do we understand that people being educated to be lawyers and doctors and philosophers and, people in a range of occupations as a public good? Do we understand that that does a service to all of us? And even beyond people on a professional level, do we understand that K through 12 funding is a whole other question, but do we understand that K through 12 and beyond education serves a democracy well? Because we want well-informed people who are able to reason well, think through critically different arguments, and engage well. And regardless, again, of particularly how we piece through the parts of this policy, like Skye, there's parts I like better than other parts. I do think one of the gifts that Christians can give publicly is to consistently be a voice that says, I'm not just thinking about me. I'm not just thinking about my community. I'm thinking about what kind of policies create a community that serves the common good in a really positive way. And we've seen, attempts to have more public education, both K through 12 and beyond, funding for that as a public kind of good. And so could we advocate for that in a more holistic way? Because Skye said, this doesn't resolve the problem. I'm more optimistic that it can do something good than he is. But regardless, there are other things that have to happen, and we have to find ways to be a voice to do that. And it's really heartbreaking that what I saw on Twitter most of the time was people kind of either proof texting verses or whining about fairness, when like the voice of the Christian community should be, how do we serve the common good in a way that, especially helps the most vulnerable?
Oh, Caitlin, we got to wrap it up. That sounded just a little bit socialist. And if there's anything I've learned from Christians in politics over the last 40 years, if you have a choice between doing the Christian thing or doing a thing that doesn't sound like socialism, you have to do the thing that doesn't sound like socialism.
We should keep talking about that, Phil.
Okay. We will continue that conversation later. Thanks, y'all, for being here. Hang out for the interview. It's a good one. It's a guy we really like. Coming up, thanks for supporting us on Patreon. We'll keep making new stuff for you on Patreon as well as here. And we will see you guys next week. Bye.
There are two narratives that are really taking hold in our day. One is that Christian leadership is inherently toxic. We've just been bombarded with stories of abusive pastors that take advantage of their positions and use their ministries and churches as their little kingdoms. The other narrative that's taken hold is that of deconstruction, which basically says anybody who's a Christian at some point has to rethink every last thing they've been taught and may end up walking away from the faith entirely. Well, as prevalent as those two narratives are, they're not the only narratives that are out there. And I'm really happy that my guest today, Rich Villodas, kind of offers a counter-narrative to those two. Rich is pastor of New Life Fellowship in Brooklyn, a large multi-ethnic church with more than 75 countries represented. That's a difficult calling in this day when people are so fractured by culture and politics. And yet Rich is modeling a way of leading that is both self-aware and integrated, but also courageous and willing to do the difficult work of pastoral ministry in this day. He also is the author of numerous books, including The Deeply Formed Life, which was the winner of Christianity Today's Book Award. And his new book is called Good and Beautiful and Kind: Becoming Whole in a Fractured World. I talked to Rich about his conversion, his upbringing, his formation in the faith, and I think what you'll pick up from all those stories, including the way he's leading right now, is a deep commitment to an inner life with Christ, to self-awareness, to health and wholeness. He brings that both into his perspective on the world and his view of leadership. Again, as I said, it's a counter-narrative to all the negative ones that we've been hearing so much of lately. I found my time with Rich inspiring and hopeful, and I think you will too. Here's my conversation with Rich Villodas. Rich, welcome to the Holy Post.
Skye, so good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, I'm so grateful you're here. As I was saying before we started recording, you and I have never met before, and yet we know so many of the same people. We've moved in the same circles. So I thought, for my benefit and the benefit of the listeners, I just want to get to know you, and we'll talk about your new book in the course of that. But let's start off with, you're from Brooklyn originally, correct?
Originally from Brooklyn, spent my first 34 years of life there, and the last 8 years in Queens.
You've gone far. You've gone very, very far.
A good 12 miles.
So tell me a little bit about your family of origin and kind of the setting in which you grew up.
Yeah, my family's of Puerto Rican descent. Grew up as the eldest of 5 in a neighborhood in Brooklyn called East New York. Lots of people are familiar with kind of the new Brooklyn, which is Manhattan adjacent. But I'm from the real Brooklyn, the East New York part of it, and grew up in that area, not in a Christian home, in a home that was quite indifferent toward to things of faith. But as a child, my parents would send me to church with my grandparents who lived down the block from me. And it was a small Latino Pentecostal church in Brooklyn, a church called Arca de Salvación, Ark of Salvation. And I would attend church as a kid there from about 5 to 12 and found myself not really understanding what was going on, stopped attending church as a 12-year-old, started going back to church as a 17-year-old at an Assemblies of God church because I started dating a pastor's daughter. And that got me back into church very quickly. And few years into that relationship, it came to an end. And as a 19-year-old, found myself back into that church that I used to go with my grandparents, having a crisis of just faith and depression and frustration with relationships. And I went to church one day, and just so happened that when I left the house, my parents who were home, my father coming off of a hangover, decides to follow me into the church that night. And 1999 and at August, 24 years, from this point on, 15 family members came to faith in Christ.
Wow.
On that one night. And so, but 7 of us in a very crammed house in Brooklyn, and came to faith at 19 years of age.
Okay, let's tease this apart a little bit. You're dating this pastor's daughter, so you end up going to church with her or for her. For some reason, I'm assuming. The relationship ends, but you then return to the church of your grandparents.
Yes.
Why? Like, was there something that you experienced at the Pentecostal church with the girlfriend that stuck with you?
Well, the church that I went to as a child was literally around the corner from my house. So, I mean, I walk there and I'm there in 2 minutes. And my first conceptions of who God was in that space there. And so I knew God to be a very holy, powerful. There was lots of legalism there, but I understood that God could transform someone's life. And so I went home that day after the relationship came to an end, just so depressed. And I just really wanted someone to pray for me. That's all I wanted. Maybe someone could pray for me. And so when I leave my parents, my 4 younger siblings who never went to church were invited to church that day by my aunt. So that's why they were there. And so I said, maybe I'll join them. Maybe someone will pray for me. And it just so happened that church that usually has about 30 people in attendance had about 90. It was a revival breaking out in that small church. And I just happened to go in that day. And some guy got up, preached from Ezekiel, a Puerto Rican preacher, preached from Ezekiel 37 about a valley of dry bones, and looked out at the congregation and said, some of you are dry, you're desolate, you're fragmented, and God wants to breathe life into you. Who wants the breath of God? and entire households that summer, not just, I'm talking about households of 10 and 12 and 15 like mine, were being rescued by Jesus in that summer. So, but that's why I went, because I had these early conceptions of who God was through those early experiences as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, and so on.
So is it fair to say that revival summer, it was a charismatic experience that was instrumental for you?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember the preacher made an invitation, and we all went to the altar, and we're all weeping, and we never showed that kind of emotion to each other. So when we got home, it was very awkward. No one's making eye contact, but it was something had happened in our own lives that we saw, and the only thing we knew what to do was we went home and said, like, what do we do next, kind of thing. And my father just said, let's just go back the following week again. So that's exactly what we did.
Years ago, I was invited to a meeting in New York with a group of other pastors and sort of Christian leaders, and some of whom you know, and a lot of us didn't know each other. And the first night we were together, we had a wonderful dinner, and our host asked us to just share our stories, go around and share, how did you come to faith? What's your background? Whatever. And what was really fascinating, and somebody brought this up the next day who was listening closely, is everyone shared their story. We came from very different backgrounds and very different parts of the country, different theological schools and denominations and stuff. The two common threads that went through everyone's story is everyone talked about trauma or pain in some significant way. And every one of us had some, what we would consider a charismatic experience, even those of us who had no charismatic backgrounds. And no one mentioned a church leader or pastor in their story.
Huh.
Which was all that was fascinating to pick apart. But the part that grabbed me was, here was this relatively young group. We were probably all in our late 30s, early 40s. And every one of us mentioned a charismatic experience that was pivotal in our coming to faith that was, and I did not come from a charismatic background at all. And many of us didn't. And yet that was still there. So I'm just intrigued that yours features that as well. At one point in the book, you talk about how when you were very young in your faith, you thought that your primary purpose was to just preach the gospel and win souls to Christ and kind of rescue souls off of the sinking ship. And you came to a different understanding of what it means to really follow Christ in this world, a more integrated. What gave you that larger vision, more integrated vision of what it means to be a Christian beyond just rescuing souls?
Yeah, those first years, I was so zealous. I mean, I would organize street preaching meetings in Brooklyn and go to the nearby projects and preach there, and very zealous. But I became a Christian at 19. By the time I was 21, 22, I was getting exposed to a world of theology from mentors, from professors, reminding me or letting me know, for that matter, that to participate in what Jesus is doing is not escape from this world, but praying your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so I think it was really the mentors that God put in my way in college and in seminary that introduced me to a more robust, integrated understanding of Christianity that incorporates the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional realities. And so, I mean, it was those early years that I got that.
You went to NIAC, correct?
I went to NIAC and then Alliance Theological Seminary.
Okay, so what's the Christian Missionary Alliance connection? How did that happen?
Well, the long answer is, or the short answer is, a zero connection. I became a Christian, and I used to listen to Christian radio very quickly. So I changed the dial very quickly. And then I heard that there was something called a Christian college. I never knew Christian colleges existed by the time I became a Christian. And then they said something called NIAC. And so I thought, I'll go there. So it wasn't until I knew nothing about the Christian Missionary Alliance until maybe my senior year when I had to take a class on A.B. Simpson. And I was like, oh, this is the guy who started it. But New Life is affiliated with the Alliance. But aside from that, it's just relational connection.
No, you're affiliated with the Alliance, but you're not official. You're not an Alliance church, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you're not, are you licensed or ordained in the Alliance?
Not at this point. The district superintendent has been asking me to do it for some time now. So hopefully in the near future, I'll get around to it.
Well, I was in Alliance church for 20 years, and licensed and ordained in the Alliance all that
Yeah.
time and stuff. So and I didn't have a history prior to that either. I was just curious about the connection. So you found really helpful and good mentors at Nyack that shaped your view of
Absolutely.
faith. Yeah.
Absolutely. And at seminary as well, a guy by the name of Gabriel Salguero, who's a dear friend of
I
mine.
know Gabe very well. Yeah.
And Gabe, I met Gabe when I was 18 years old, and he came to preach in my small church in Brooklyn. And so, I've been a friend of his for a couple of decades now, but he's been like one of the people who God has put in my path that gave me a broader view of what it means to follow Jesus.
So I don't know how to ask this question without sounding terrible. What was it of benefit to you as you were forming your faith and walking in those early years and learning from these mentors? Was it helpful to you to not have 20 years of church baggage from, or was that a detriment?
Here's the thing. This is where, for folks who are deconstructing and they're in that phase, I intellectually understand where they're going, but I have zero emotional connection in this way. That has not been my experience whatsoever.
Right.
And so I became a Christian again as a 19-year-old. And by the time I was 21, I was being exposed to the Desert Fathers. I was being exposed to the contemplative tradition. I was being exposed to like a social justice kind of paradigm of following Jesus. And so I was getting all the best of a global historic Christian faith by the time I was 2 years into it. And so I had very little baggage whatsoever. The biggest baggage was because I came from a Pentecostal tradition and became a Christian there, that, women couldn't wear pants and guys had to shave their mustaches off, whatever. So, that was like the biggest area, I guess, that I had to think through. But apart from that, I had very little hangups about faith and Christianity. As a matter of fact, for me, it was all positive in terms of what I was seeing in the world. So, was it a gift that I didn't come to faith until I was 19 or 20 years old and then for me, I think it is. So, because I have very little baggage that I've had to deal with from previous years and previous experiences.
Again, this is something I don't mean to sound negative, but like I encounter so many people who do have that baggage, and I'm sure you do too.
Yeah.
And obviously we try to raise children up in the church with the best of intentions but I've honestly wondered at times, are we just setting people up for failure when you look at either the deconstruction or the abandonment of faith that seems to be so common now for teenagers and young adults? And what would it look like? Let's say you had been raised in the church. What would it have looked like if you had been raised and had gone, I don't know, to Sunday school or some kind of children's ministry that introduced you to these concepts of the Desert Fathers and the contemplative life and the stuff you write about so beautifully in your books? How wonderful a childhood faith would that have been? But it seems like we seem to be doing the opposite of that in many of our ministries. And then people reach young adulthood and go, this Christianity thing, I got to get rid of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when I think about wholeness, I often think in terms of a life of integrity, integration, and intimacy. That is how to love well. And I think if we were really discipled in the way of congruence, what's happening on the inside is consistent with what's happening on the outside. Integration, that all of the various parts of who I am are held together in worship before God. And then learning how to love well. I think if we did have those models, if we were able to wrestle with our faith and ask questions out loud. When I became a Christian, I had so many questions. And I had my grandfather and a few other mentors who there was no question that was out of bounds whatsoever. And so I was able to bring them my questions on a regular basis about what I was seeing in the scriptures, inconsistencies, and they were held. They gave me a safe space to ask those questions. And so, I think if we had those things early on, safe space to ask questions, a robust faith that integrates all these things, and really seeing the church beyond our specific tradition, I think that'll do. I have a son who loves chicken nuggets and French fries. That's all he wants to eat. He's 8 years old. That's all he wants to eat. And, we went to a nice restaurant the other day and he just wanted chicken nuggets and French fries. And I'm saying, Nathan, look at this menu. There's a lot to eat from. And he goes, no, I just want chicken nuggets and French fries. And I think it's cute for him. But for lots of Christians, we're like a chicken nuggets and French fries eating people. And that we're just stuck with our one tradition and there's nothing outside of it. And we've missed the feast that is the global historic faith and the kingdom of God that has been revealed. And so, yeah, I think that's what I received. I received very early on a robust vision of what Christianity is and how it's manifested over millennia. And that has been a great gift for me.
Okay, so there's a parallel here between what you experienced as a younger Christian versus what a lot of people do with the baggage, the chicken nuggets and French fries that they. Okay, and your experience as a church leader. Here's the narrative that I often hear. I know you have too. A relatively young adult goes into ministry. They enter the machine of ministry, and the way we tend to do it in the United States, or at least in the Western world. And some years go by, and they have some kind of catastrophic implosion. It might be a moral failure, which gets a lot of attention. It could just be an emotional, physical implosion from the stress, or relational implosion with their family. Some trauma that comes on them, and then they have some kind of an epiphany around, the way I've been doing ministry is broken and wrong, and I need to rebuild this whole thing. From what I've read from you, I don't hear that narrative. What I hear is somebody who entered into the Christian life, was exposed to a broad, many streams of Christian thought and thinking and a healthy theology, enters into ministry, and then does the slow, gradual, formative work of living in those integrated ways that you're talking about. And it's not like you don't have issues or sin or baggage that you're dealing with, but you're slowly working it through in a healthy sort of non-catastrophic kind of way. That's not the norm. That is not the norm. So what led you to that on that soul level formative side of things?
I mean, here it is for me, Skye, and I don't want to be too simplistic here. Over the course of my journey, I had multiple wise women and men who mentored me along the way. And so I can give you the names. My grandfather, Marcus Rios, for the first 8 months of me becoming a Christian, I sat at his bedside for 2 to 3 hours a day, four to five times a week for 8 months before he died. And he was very ill at that time. And he mentored me for 8 months in the scriptures and prayer. And then I went to down the block, my Aunt Minerva and my Aunt Lydia, who asked, I had all the questions in the world for them. And they sat with me and were very patient with me. And then I went to college and met a guy named Ron Walborn, who was very instrumental in helping me think through.
I know Ron also.
Faith. And so Ron was a steady presence. And then someone like Gabriel. And then by the time I was 28 years old, I met Pete Scazzaro, who I would end up succeeding him a few years later. And being part of a church that was very healthy, not without its problems, but very healthy. And so I have had multiple mentors along the journey, from my grandparents to my aunts to some professors to a pastor, that I don't have that story of burnout and deconstruction. And I'm not saying I'm better than anyone else in that way. It's just so, but I've had people along the way. I can't really chalk it up to my own self. I think God has been gracious in surrounding me with a number of people. And I do think that can be replicated. I don't have any secret sauce in my neighborhood in Brooklyn that made me do it. But I had people along the way, 5 to 7 of them in particular, that really helped me to not fall down those traps that I think a lot of other leaders fall into.
You mentioned the people who mentored you, and you mentioned the Desert Fathers as being an influence early on in your formation. What other non-living mentors have you had, like books and resources, have deeply shaped the way you think about your ministry and your life in faith?
Yeah, along in that monastic tradition, Thomas Merton for me has been one of the most important voices, because what Merton did, Merton is he's a monk in Kentucky, but he writes so powerfully about what's happening in the world. And so here he is cloistered behind monastic walls, and at the same time writing about racism and writing about war and writing about peacemaking. And so I saw in Merton from very early on, I read Merton's The 7-Story Mountain when I was 21 years old. And for the last 22 years have been enamored by how he's thought about faith. And so someone like Merton, someone like Nouwen, who has, when I read The Return of the Prodigal Son, his work has really, and he did as well because of his work in L'Arche, working with people with severe disabilities. He himself was finding out how to integrate faith in very practical ways in the world. I also think, when I went to Alliance, I mean, I'm not sure if they approved these books, Skye, but I was reading James Cone at an Alliance seminary. And when I was being introduced to someone who was talking about justice in the world and what does it mean to love well? And when I would hear things like, did Jesus come to save your soul or your body? And the answer was yes. That was like a very big paradigm shift. And so those are some of the voices for me that early on began to shape the trajectory of my life. But it's interesting that it's in this kind of monastic bent and in this kind of justice bent that I've tried to hold these two together. And in my context, is kind of like holding together monastery and mission field. That's been kind of the ways that I've tried to follow Jesus over the last couple of decades.
When I was, I had a journey to faith as a high school student that the real hinge point was when I was 18 between high school and college. And then I went off to a secular university and I was taking philosophy classes my freshman year at this university. And there was a graduate student in the philosophy department who was grading papers. And he somehow intuited through something I had written in one of my papers that I might be a Christian. And he was sort of a closeted Christian in the philosophy department at this very secular university. And he kind of grabbed me after class. He said, hey, I want to meet up with you and talk about your paper. And we had this clandestine meeting on a park bench in the middle of town. It's very much like an espionage novel where you're sitting on the park bench and not really. And he passes me a few books. And one of them was a Henry Nouwen book. And he's like, I think you might find this interesting. And it was like, I took the book from him, like no one could see it. It was very bizarre. And that was sort of my beginning down that journey as well. And it was, I'm indebted to that guy. I don't even remember his name, but it's so formative. Those early exposures you have to those living and dead mentors and your vision of ministry, your vision of the faith and the church, all that is so formative. And when that concrete is wet, oh man, and then it sets, it can be an incredibly strong foundation if it's set right. But if it isn't and it's malformed, it leads to sometimes decades of upheaval and chaos. As you look out, we'll get into some recent stuff in a minute, but as you look out on just the church today and church leaders today, what gives you hope and what breaks your heart about what you're seeing right now as the church seems to be floundering or struggling in some ways?
Well, in some ways, I think about, after January 6th, I preached a message on the baptism of Jesus and who we belong to. And providentially, that Sunday after January 6th was in the church calendar, the baptism of Jesus, focusing on that. So I didn't know that until afterwards. And I mentioned a couple of things like corrosive racism and cable news discipleship and charismatic prophecies gone awry and conspiracy theories. And so in some ways, I think the church has been co-opted in some really sad ways. And so that's big picture what I see in terms of things that make my heart just grieve. I also think about the chaotic pace that pastors and leaders live with, the lack of integration, the ability or the inability or the refusal to think theologically about very big issues of our society. And so whether we're being co-opted by left or right, we're not thinking with a theological framework, but often with a very secularized way of understanding our moment in history. So that's very discouraging. At the same time, I've met plenty of pastors along the way. And part of it in my work, with emotionally healthy discipleship and the work that I do, we get a lot of pastors conference over the year. And so I've seen lots of pastors work hard to integrate their inner life and their outer life and to think about the pace of life that they're living and to think theologically. I'm also encouraged, at least in New York City, there is a beautiful spirit of collaboration between pastors. And I've seen that. I was just in Long Beach, California, a couple of months ago, where I saw greater collaboration that I've seen in previous years. And so those are some of the things that I think about when we realize we need one another as pastors and leaders. Those are some of the things that are giving me hope. And those are some of the things that are grieving my heart as well.
So in your book, you draw in various sections of it, you draw from family systems theory.
Yeah.
which I've been dabbled in over the years. And one of the critical components of family systems theory is this idea of self-differentiation. And you mentioned that sermon after January 6th. The ability for a pastor to get up in front of their congregation and lovingly say difficult things, knowing that you're going to upset some people here, but doing it anyway, and face the blowback, face the criticism, face the anger. It comes from an ability to self-differentiate, to be secure in who you are and what you are, and yet still do what you're called to do, regardless of what, and yet not do it in a way which is indifferent to the reality of where people are. What are some of the critical disciplines that move a pastor or a leader or a parent, for that matter, to a place of self-differentiation where they can do that in a non-anxious, calm way? Because as I look around the country and I engage with pastors, that's what I see lacking so much. Is the inability of shepherds to shepherd because they're scared of their flock.
Yeah. Well,
but you seem to have a healthy, grasp of that. What do you tell other pastors as a way to find that?
Well, I think that's been the story of my recent years. I think pastors respond in one or two ways. We can speak and preach and lead out of self-differentiation or naivete. I did so early on. I was non-anxious because I was kind of reckless with some of my words and thinking, oh, no one's going to be upset with this. For example, after Ferguson and, we start seeing what's happening in more racial tensions, I got up on a Sunday and started just talking without really recognizing some people are going to be very offended about this. And people go, Rich, you're so courageous. Part of it was I didn't know what I was doing. And so
you were stupid. You weren't courageous.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so it wasn't until people started leaving that I go, oh, wait a minute. Now, at that point, I have one or two options. I could now try to please everyone and not say anything, or I can continue to be reckless with my words. And I think the opposite is self-differentiation. Differentiation is this idea: I want to remain close and curious to God, close and curious to myself, and close and curious to others, especially in times of high anxiety, and resist the polar opposite pull of cutting people off or being enmeshed into people. And so that's self-differentiation. I want to remain connected, but not have my actions or reactions determined by you. And part of it is just moving along that journey is understanding what that term is and my tendencies. Do I have a tendency to cut people off emotionally, or do I disappear into them where my voice is now submerged because of fear? And I think for me, that work has been incredible times of reflection about my own fears, my own anxieties, and we all have them. My own ability to self-regulate. And that's why contemplative prayer has been so important to me, to recognize my own anxiety and to offer that before Jesus and to allow the Holy Spirit to do something in my soul so that I can be present to those in our community. But I think it also means, how am I taking a stand, hopefully through a stand that's informed by gospel values, and at the same time surrounding myself with people who can speak into that. And so I think for me, it's been a communal process. Whenever I write a document over the past 2 years, I've written documents on public health. I've written documents on racism, politics, sexuality to try to pastor our congregation. And every time I do so, I recognize I need a multitude of voices to help me craft these documents. And then I need people to just, encourage me to press send when everything inside of me doesn't want to press send. And so I think all those things, but at the end of the day, Skye, I have to lead this community and shepherd this community. And I want to do it lovingly, truthfully, and with integrity. And that's been my definition of my definition of integrity is not living something perfectly, but wrestling with something faithfully. And if I can wrestle with something faithfully in my own life, personally and as a pastor, I think I'm doing okay. But it is that call to remain close to God, to myself, and to others in times of high anxiety.
So I'm sure you've gotten this question many times, especially as you work with pastors. When I was with Christianity Today, Leadership Journal, and even now with what I'm doing at Holy Post and elsewhere, I often will hear pastors ask me, like, well, what's the right model? what do I need to change in the way our church is organized in order to be more effective or to keep people here or to reach young people, whatever it might be. And over the years, I've given up on that. Like I have opinions, I have thoughts, but it's context dependent in so many ways.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I've kind of concluded that it's about what you guys are doing. It's about what Pete's doing. It's the emotionally healthy leader. It's the emotionally healthy system that is going to determine whether or not disciples are actually formed in the way of Christ or they're formed in something else. And sadly, it's relatively rare to find that emotionally healthy leader at the center of these systems. When you talk to other pastors today and we look at the political divisions, the social divisions, the high anxiety that's going on, coming out of the pandemic, we're heading into another tumultuous election season. How are you coaching them? I mean, you've already mentioned the contemplative life, that integrated thing. What are the disciplines that you do to break through to that inner stuff of what's really going on inside of me?
Well, I think part of it, the biggest part is, am I paying attention to my own functioning? Am I paying attention to the way I'm showing up in the world? Am I paying attention to my own reactions? There's lots of revelation to be found in our reactions. And I have found that when I take the time, not just in prayer, but in self-examination and in interior examination to pay attention to my own reactions, I'm able to now function in a different place. And so, for example, I remember the year 2020, we had, you remember that year, Skye? And
I try not to.
And we had this, Biden and Trump, our election days coming. And one of our pastors emailed me and said, "Hey, Rich, why don't we have a Zoom conversation highlighting two congregants, one who's voting for Biden, one who's voting for Trump, and we'll do it on Zoom in front of everyone. It'll be wonderful." And I thought, we're never going to do this. And she kind of responded like, but we're like the emotionally healthy church. And I'm thinking that's when Pete was leading this thing. This is a new day. We're not going to do it. And so a couple of days later, she said, "What if we got two elders to do it?" And I thought, even worse, this is going to really mess up the church. So after a few days, I thought, all right, we'll do it. And we identified a couple of people in that way. One, a Puerto Rican man in his 60s who was voting for Biden, a Korean American man in his 50s voting for Trump. And this was going to be moderated by an African American male, a millennial. That's how we do it in Queens here. And so we have the conversation, and there starts to be some things are said. It overall went well, but that built into the next year where I started preaching on politics, more fractures in our society, in our congregation. And a bunch of people started emailing me about, can we have a Zoom meeting about all the things that you're preaching, Rich, from that Zoom thing to the conversation. And I found myself so anxious. And I think, Skye, what I tell pastors is very simply this: unless we're really paying attention to our own reactions and our own bodies, we're going to have a hard time being truly present to people. And so one guy said, "A pillar of our congregation, can we have a 2-hour meeting on Zoom?" I thought, this is awful. And I said, "Can we make it 75 minutes? And he wanted to talk about some of his problems he was seeing. And an hour before that meeting, I was not getting good sleep. I was very anxious. And I decided I need to go on a bench on Queens Boulevard, much like your bench earlier in the story here, sat down with God and just reflected on what are the stories or the lies that I'm believing. And I remember naming 7 different messages that were really faulty thinking, kind of deceptive brain messages that I was holding on.
You outline these in the book beautifully.
That's exactly, and it was that story there. And I have to really just, once I got to that point of, when I bring up delicate issues, I'm causing division. Like that was something deeply ingrained in me. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, Jesus did a whole lot of things where he was bringing up some delicate issues and he wasn't causing division whatsoever. I think if I can get pastors, and that's what I've done as I coach pastors, as I'm in relationship with pastors and friends, how can I recognize those deeply embedded messages in my soul that are really sabotaging my own life and my leadership? And if I can start there and help them to not avoid themselves, sadly, we often use God to run from God, and we use God to run from ourselves. And so I think if I can help pastors not to use God to run from themselves, we can show up better in this world as leaders and be truly present to the presence of other people around us.
Okay, last question, because we're running out of time. I could talk to you for hours. Maybe we'll get a chance to do that at some point. You are ministering in a very diverse setting, obviously, in every way. Ethnic diversity, political diversity, economic diversity. And so when you present a point of view or a message that you've really wrestled with thoughtfully through the gospel, through theology, and you present it, you know this is probably going to upset somebody, but it's probably going to delight someone else because there's enough diversity there that, What do you say to those leaders or those people who are in really homogenous churches? And it could be homogenous politically on the right or left, culturally, ethnically, whatever. Like, for example, I had a pastor call me up. He was in California a couple of years ago in the midst of, maybe it's 2021. And he was basically saying, I think I need to leave the pastorate because I am completely out of sync with everybody in my congregation because they had bought hook, line, and sinker the church into a lot of these conspiracy theories and views. And he's like, I don't know how to pastor them when if I say anything, I'm going to be strung up on this. So what do you say to those leaders or people who are in environments where it's not really diversity, it's just they feel like the black sheep? They're the one who doesn't conform to everything else.
Yeah. For leaders, my first really comment is, do you really feel called to shepherd this community? And along those lines, I have a very different problem, Skye, in that, when I started preaching on racism, 100 people left and then 100 people joined us very quickly. And so that's kind of been the revolving door in many ways over the last couple of years. But as a pastor, what I'm trying to invite other pastors to do is to really contemplate what are the formational spaces to help process others. A number of years ago, I used my pulpit to just get a point across. And in many ways, I wasn't pastoring my congregation. I was pastoring the internet and making sure that the people that follow me online could retweet what I'm doing or feel good. And I realized I'm not pastoring those people. I'm pastoring the people right in front of me. And what it meant for me was, how do I create small spaces where I can tease out and have conversation around some very difficult issues with people in my congregation. And sometimes that's around dinner tables. Sometimes that's a mid-sized group. But I don't think these things are not going to happen in a 30-minute sermon. It requires so much unhurried conversation. And I think that's what I would invite people to. Can you invite people over your home, share a meal, and say, can I just talk about some of the things that are on my heart, and how can we understand one another a little bit more and live into more curiosity with one another? That's my invitation. I don't think it's going to happen on a Sunday morning in a sermon, but if we can create these spaces in our communities, I do think there's some hope that can emerge out of that and some healing that can emerge out of that as well. But that's usually what I say. What are the small formational spaces that you can create around tables for these conversations in your community?
It's a healthy reminder that making disciples, shepherding people, it can't be done in mass. It can't be done efficiently on scale the way we want it to be done. It's human to human. It's relational. And that's what the Christian life has always been. Rich, thank you so much for your time and for your new book, Good and Beautiful and Kind, Becoming Whole in a Fractured World. We just need this. The church needs this. Every leader needs this. This book is the fruit of your own work in your own soul, and that comes through and in your own church. So thank you for that. It's a gift to all of us. Grateful that you were here.
Thanks so much, Skye. Great to be with you.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.